Hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining me during DigiLeaders Week, where we talk about why inclusion in content still has a long way to go and what we can do about it. I'm your speaker, Justine. I'm a marketing director at the L Factor Limited, and I'm very passionate about turning complex data into the right stories in the B2B tech space. Our agenda today is to talk about AI's impact on inclusive content, how to intentionally create inclusive content, and accessibility in your brand and content. I've submitted some presentation notes so that you can follow on, including a slide deck that will show you all of the resources used for this talk in case you want to do a little deep dive yourself. Let's get started. Why is inclusion in content important? There is a few reasons why, including a commercial challenge where brands failing to act on diversity, equity, and inclusion will risk losing out on a 102 billion annual spend from marginalized groups. Now, of course, in terms of content, this can either be an enabler or a barrier to diverse communities. As marketers, the way we turn complex data into stories matter. When content is inclusive, it is more likely to be able to be accessed by a wider range of audience. This means that the way we write and produce content is important because it needs to be accessible for us to reach more people. So, what about AI's impact on inclusive content? I think that generative AI has led to a very interesting scenario. What I've observed is that there are a few challenges. So, generative AI on the whole has led to an increase in a sense of urgency to produce at higher speeds. This means that there is an increase in the spread of misinformation because fact-checking is often skipped in the editorial process of busy teams. And I think that as AI prompters, we're actually responsible for taking a step back and looking at the impact this has. One of which is the challenge of our own bias as the prompters, because this actually impacts the content created. A challenge that I've observed is that how our conscious and unconscious bias influences the type of prompts that we use and also the editorial process needed in order to identify these biases and look into the way that we are using language, which means that when we see the final product produced by generative AI, we need to be aware of this. How? Well, one solution is to take accountability by removing our unconscious bias and reviewing our language choices in terms of then also creating an intentional editing process. What does this mean? I think a couple of action points that we can take is to learn gender neutral language. So, for example, the use of they, them pronouns instead of she, he, removing gender binary, and also making efforts in addressing people as people who identify as female or people who identify as male. We also need to make sure that fact checking is part of the creation process so that we can address any misinformation that the AI can actually mistakenly push out. And we must also use this editorial process as a chance to do sensitivity checks. So in other words, high level takeaways is to be intentional with your language, adapt an inclusive review process, ensure representation in your design, in your imagery, and address any counter stereotypes. What does counter stereotype mean? Well, a study by the National Library of Medicine actually defines this term as the way we make stereotypical assumptions about appropriate male and female social roles and the extent to which these roles are filled. And they're a couple of years old. Salesforce actually has some really great examples of stereotypes, which includes two guys in love, a female CEO, and a disabled athlete. So, how do you actually intentionally create inclusive content? What does this look like? I think that it can fall under a couple of buckets in terms of understanding your audience, intentionally creating your content and thinking about the distribution channels, using inclusive language, of ensuring representation in your design direction, and fact-checking content that is generated by AI. So what do I mean by understanding your audience? So I think that this comes down to thinking about a few things such as how is your audience likely to consume your content? What are the common behaviors of your audience? What kind of tone of voice are they likely to respond better to? Number two, in terms of intentionally thinking about your distribution channels, is more about not having to be on every single social media channel. That's not a strategy. What I mean by this is having more of a audience first approach so that your distribution channel looks at knowing their preferred content format. Questions that you might ask yourself is, are they more likely to engage with video? Are they more likely to engage with video with subtitles? Or perhaps blog posts or podcasts? A great content strategy will look at an existing form of content and see how you can repurpose this into these more accessible content formats. Now, in terms of using inclusive language and point three, we touched on this a little earlier with our example of using gender-neutral language such as they, them pronouns. But of course, this goes deeper. I think that it's about making sure that you are avoiding ableist language, taking care to choose a diverse set of names in your user personas, and writing about your feature updates in inclusive ways. So, for example, if you have a notification as a fintech company and it's an error message that someone couldn't withdraw money, you need to be mindful of the language that you use in order to address this. When it comes to ensuring representation in your design direction, one action you can do right now is to look at the images of your people in your website and think about how diverse this is. If it's not as diverse as you'd like it to be, think about action points and update this. Last but not least, fact-checking and the content generated by AI. This is very much a concern because a common mistake that people make whenever it concerns AI is asking it to produce something and posting this without actually reviewing the work that it produced, which has, of course, led to a lot of misinformation and will actually harm your brand reputation over time. And if you would like to look at some examples of inclusive brands and content, I've got a few on the Deck 13, which looks at a audio that we produced to accompany a long form guide, like the one we did at the Factor Limited. I also suggest you have a look at Google's Developer Documentation Style Guide, which has a lot of real world examples and also Kantar's Brand Inclusion Index of the UK's most inclusive brands across different categories, including, for example, skincare, financial services, soft drinks, and mobile, with examples such as Dove, Nationwide, Coca-Cola, and Vodafone. If you would like to have a look into guidance on creating inclusive content, three sources that I highly recommend is again Google's Developer Documentation Style Guide, Atlassian's Design System, which has great examples on inclusive language, writing guidelines, and more, ranging from written content to feature updates, and also Microsoft's Inclusive Design Principles and a video series that accompanies this. Again, I very much highly recommend you check out these resources. So what about addressing accessibility in your brand and content? But what is accessibility in content? The World Wide Web Consortium actually defines accessible content as something people with disabilities can equally perceive, understand, navigate, and interact with websites and tools. Now, in particular, what's important to know is that accessibility in your brand and content, both online, offline, too, is not a nice to have. It is, in fact, a legal requirement. So, in terms of what this looks like in practice, ISBA actually has some great definitions on accessible marketing and accessibility in advertising, where accessible marketing is the use of inclusive design practices that make it possible for users of all abilities to fulfill, experience the brand, receive and understand communication, and take advantage of opportunities to engage with the brand, services, or products. In terms of advertising, accessibility in advertising addresses the campaign's ability to be experienced by those with a form of impairment. This may involve breaking down multiple barriers across sight and sound, including color, brightness, subtitles, sign language, sound, volume, and language. I've left a link to the resource for ISBA, which I highly recommend you check out on slide 17. Now, what does accessibility in your content actually look like? There are a few things that help with this. First is the WCAG, which is used by designers and developers to create user experiences that are more inclusive. It covers a wide range of recommendations for making your web content more accessible. There is also the use of the 4 principles of accessibility, which we'll go into shortly, and a use of alt text, which is the text that you use to describe the visual on your website. Now, in terms of the 4 principles of accessibility, there are a few points to cover. The first principle is perceivable. This is all about the information and user interface components that must be presentable to users in a way that they can perceive. So what does this mean? It means that the audience must be able to perceive information that is being presented and it can't be invisible to their senses. The second principle is operable. This talks about the way user interface components and navigation must be operable. So this means that the user must be able to operate the interface, and the interface cannot require interaction that a user cannot perform. You can't ask someone to do something they cannot do. In the third principle, we have understandable. This is information and the operation of user interface must be understandable. What does this mean? It's more about how the user must be able to understand the information as well as the operation of the user interface. So in other words, the content or operation cannot be beyond their understanding. Number four is robust, which is a principle that guides us on how content must be robust enough so that it can be interpreted reliably by a wide variety of user agents, including assistive technologies. So what does this mean? It's more about making sure that the user must be able to access the content as technologies advance. So, for example, if it is a written blog, an audio by AI must be able to read this blog out loud. I've also listed some sources on the W3 for if you want to look into these principles in more detail. Now, when it comes to accessibility in your brand, a high-level overview looks at the brand colors that you use and also how accessible your font choice is, which of course includes your typography and the size of the font chosen. Martin Hopkins, an agency, actually has a really good example of what accessible text passing color contrast check looks like, which I've left for you in slide 21. Thank you so much for joining me in this talk today. I hope that it's helped and you've got some action points that can be done right away. I hope that you also have looked into some resources that I've left for you, including a few links on some interesting articles, such as a guide to creating inclusive content and language by the National Institute for Health Research, and 5 ways to make your brand more accessible and inclusive by Martin Hopkins. Thank you so much for your time. If you have any follow-up questions, I'd love to have a chat. Please feel free to get in touch with me via email at justine@thelfactorlimited, that's shortened to ltd.com, or check out our website at www.thelfactorlimited.com. Thank you so much. Have a great day, y'all. Bye.